Hi, everybody. This is Bob Gale, co-creator of Back to the Future, and you're listening to Brad Gilmore.
Doc! Okay, relax, Doc. It's me. It's Martin.
No, it can't be. Just sent you back to the future.
Yeah. Oh, I know you did send me back to the future, but I'm back. I'm back from the future.
Great Scott.
Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
The way I see it, if you're gonna build a time machine into a car, why not do it with some style?
Whoa, this is heavy.
All right, guys. Brad Gilmore here. Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast. The only podcast looking back in time at the greatest film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. Again, I'm your friend in time, Brad Gilmore. Y'all are getting a mobile edition of Back to the Future, the podcast. I am en route to a destination, and I put it in the GPS, and it said, you got 40 minutes-ish. So I pulled out my handy Zoom pod track recorder, which, by the way, I just got. I've been a big Zoom H4n user for at least a decade, and I switched over to this pod track over the weekend, and I really like it. You know, it has 4 channels. You can even have soundboard on it. You can each have your own audio out to hear your headsets and stuff if you need that. It's a really nifty little studio. Kind of reminds me of the Rode Procaster, or what is it called? Procaster. Yeah, Rodecaster. The Rodecaster 1 and 2, which I have as well, and this works like a dream. You know, it's much smaller and mobile, and it doesn't have all the capabilities, I don't think, that the Rodecaster does, but it does a great job. So shout out to Zoom. That's not even a product placement. Not even a product placement, but you know what? Shout out to Zoom. I am recovering from what was quite the weekend at the George R. Brown Convention Center in Houston, Texas. A lot of you have probably already heard, by the time this goes up, the live podcast that we did at Comic Palooza. When I say we, I mean myself, Michael Carroll, Sean, the mayor of Nerdtropolis, and Jeff Smith, who's the documentarian for Whodunit, the Clue documentary. And he also co-hosts Clue the Movie Podcast with me. And if y'all haven't checked out Clue the Movie Podcast, again, I know I've given it several plugs, and y'all have heard Jeff on this show before, and I think I even played the pilot edition of the show on here. I really have had so much fun watching a movie 1 minute at a time. And to be honest with you, the first time I ever heard of that concept was Back to the Future Minute, which I was supposed to be a guest on, but my internet connection was awful, and I couldn't do the show. I mean, I was in the room. Me and Norman Binford, shout out to DJ Normie Norm from Rucker Park. We were in the room trying to do it and get him done, but I just couldn't get my internet to work back then, and I had an old MacBook. Anyway, these are minor details. That's the first time I heard of the by the minute way of looking at a movie and doing a podcast by it. Because I'll be honest with you, the Back to the Future podcast, the one that you're listening to right now, to give you a brief origin story, I was in college. This is 9 years ago. I remember it vividly, although I don't remember the class because I wasn't paying attention. But I was in a class, and it was coming up on 2015, or it was 2015, but coming up on Future Day of 2015, and it was early in the year. I started thinking about, man, I can't believe this is the year that they went back to the future. We're in it. This is crazy. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, what am I going to do with my solo feed, the Brad Gilmore Show? And at the time, the Brad Gilmore Show was just a weekly podcast where we broke down the underground hip-hop scene in Houston. That's exactly what it was. So, I mean, I talked to rappers pretty much every week. So whether that be Slim Thug, Paul Wall, Chameleon Air, those are a few that I had on. RZA was on the show, and a lot of underground cats who've, you know, gone on since to do a lot of great things. Shout out to them all. But I was trying to think of, you know, hey, what are my next episodes going to be for the Brad Gilmore Show? And then I said, you know, it'd be cool to do a 6 to 8 episode arc of a retrospective on Back to the Future. And that's how the show started. It was a Back to the Future retrospective. And so I started reaching out to people, and that's where I reached out to Jason Aaron and Kevin Pike and Jeffrey Weissman and Claudia Wells, all who were on early episodes of the show. And I thought, man, this is cool. They all said yes. Wow, okay. And then I said, well, I'm starting to get all these episodes. Cassine Gaines was on one of the early ones. I said, I'm getting all these episodes. Maybe it should just be its own feed. And at the time, I didn't know anybody who had more than one podcast. This is, again, early, but this pre-podcast boom period. This is when, Adam Carolla was still the podfather and all that. So I didn't know anybody who had more than one podcast, and I was a little bit concerned about trying to keep that up, And anyway, long story short, I went ahead and said, look, I'm going to make my own feed. It'll be Back to the Future, the retrospective, which then morphed to Back to the Future, the podcast. And we'll just talk about it for this 8-10 episode run, and that'll be it. And then what I found while trying to put this podcast together was how much I enjoyed it. I just enjoyed talking about the movie, and what this podcast made me do was learn more about the movie than I ever had before, and really look at it and think about it and understand it at a deeper level. And I actually got a note from somebody on Twitter the other day. I don't know if I could pull this up while I'm at a red light. I'm really playing risky business here. If I can pull it up, I will. But I got a Twitter mention from somebody the other day talking about the podcast and how they had just discovered it and they didn't know that it existed. And hold on, let me see if I can find this. Let's see, scroll. Where is this? It's got to be here. So, here it is. This is from Cosmic Blink is his name, or their name, on Twitter. I just discovered your Back to the Future of the podcast. I know, almost 10 years late. It started off a little shaky, but you quickly won me over with some great guests and co-hosts. I enjoy discussions. I know you've done a lot since then, but I wanted to say thanks, #pinheads. And so I want to give a shout out to Cosmic Blink because it has been a passion project. And what I've loved most about this show is I'm kind of happy that I didn't know a lot about the movie. I didn't know a lot that all of you probably listening to the show would scream at me through your headphones or through your car speaker, being, how do you not know that? You're getting this wrong. Because just because this has been my favorite movie doesn't mean I'm the foremost expert. And I almost feel on this show like a guy I've interviewed before and gotten to meet a couple times in person, Rick Harrison from the Pawn Stars. Rick, and by the way, I dropped that because I really enjoyed the interview that we did on the Collection podcast. But Rick, if you've ever seen Pawn Stars, P-A-W-N, not the other one, he, will know about an item. Somebody brings an item into his shop, say it's a historical document signed by a president. He'll tell you about the item. He knows some of the background of the item. And then he goes, what? What does he always do? Hey, I'd like to call in an expert and to really take a look at this. And that's what I feel like I've done with this show is I know enough, but I want to call in experts. I want people who know more than me on the show. It's like Denzel said in American Gangster, the loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. And sometimes I just want to ask the questions and get the information. And it's just kind of ironic that after I've hosted a Back to the Future podcast, I am looked at as the aficionado, and in some ways, I guess it's an apropos title, but in a lot of ways, it's not, right? I am a fan. I will always be a fan. And just because I'm a fan doesn't mean I know everything. Just because I talk on this show doesn't mean I know everything. Just because I wrote a book about it doesn't mean I'm the expert on it. And like the book's the same way as the podcast. I put that book out, and then 2 years later, I know way more than when I was writing the book, which I'm working on doing something about that, by the way. But anyway, that's my point. My point is it's great to grow. And it's great to grow with something. And it's great for y'all to hear my growth. If you go listen from this show today and you go back and listen to the very first episode I put out in 2015, I actually sound different. because it's been 9 years, almost 10. And there's been 3 or 4 times I've really contemplated not doing this podcast anymore. I don't know, through perhaps my own anxieties about certain things, and I just never want to do anything that would ever hurt the podcast or hurt the franchise, which I don't know what I could do, but you know what I'm saying. I just want to make sure I live up to the billing. And there's been times I've gotten busy and not been able to be as attentive to it. There's been times I've recorded episodes, as you know, and lost them. But this weekend that I had, getting prepared to do the Back to the Future live podcast, you know, having conversations, as you've heard, the last several episodes have just been interviews I've done for other things where Back to the Future had some sort of connection to it, whether that be Leslie Zemeckis, Bill Maher, who was on the show, the guys from Cobra Kai, Eli Roth, John Cryer, all of them being on the show, I think made it, you know, interesting to hear how Back to the Future is really a part of everybody's life. But I've been reinvigorated by it, and I really want to bring brand new episodes to you all and really kill it. I mean, I've been working on this season 10 for like a year now. I think we've done more episodes this season than ever. And I think that this podcast today is serving as a nice little epilogue, I think, to season 10. Now, I know I haven't finished the Paradox chapters or script yet, podcast yet. I am going to do that. But I do think this is a nice place to put a pin in season 10, because that live show was so much fun. And boy, does 45 minutes go by fast. They give you 45 minutes at this comic convention. Let me actually give you this. Here's the story that I'm going to end with. This is my epilogue. So, I got to give a shout out to Laker Jim. Laker Jim has he has been on this show with the Fletch podcast. I had the guys from Fletchcast on, and we talked about the 85 trilogy theory and Back to the Future and Fletch, and, you know, 2 of my favorite movies of all time. And I even like Fletch Lives. I even like Confess Fletch. But Laker Jim would agree Back to the Future is a better trilogy than the 3 Fletch movies we have. But nevertheless, Laker Jim texts me and says, "Oh, look," because let me say this: I am not plugged into the comic convention scene. I've been to, prior to this weekend, 2 Comic Cons. And they were both Comic Palooza. They were both in Houston. They were both for Reality of Wrestling, because I was calling the wrestling shows that we were doing there. But Laker Jim texts me and says, "Hey, check this out." And he sends me a text with a link of Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox. We're going to be in Houston at Comic Palooza. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's crazy. And, you know, he said, you got to find a way to be there. And again, I don't go to Comic Cons. It's not that I wouldn't like them, because I actually had a hell of a time over the weekend. But I just never go. I never think about going. So, anyway, I go and look up Comic Palooza, look up when it is. Okay, it's at the end of May. I'm in town. I'm not doing anything. Let me just send an email over. So I sent an email to the Comic Palooza staff, and I want to give them a big shout out. They were awesome. And I said, hey, my name is Brad Gilmore. I'm with CW39, ESPN Radio. I do a Back to the Future podcast. Would love to. I see that Michael J. and Christopher Lloyd are going to be here. Would love to be involved in some kind of way. And really, I had no idea of how I wanted to be involved. I would have loved to do media with them, you know, but I'm sure they get that request in every place they go. And I've had Christopher Lloyd on the show, and I'm so thankful for that. So I'm thinking, okay, that's, I just want to get involved some kind of way. So I didn't have any thoughts. Heard back from them a couple days later. Hey, Brad, thanks for reaching out. We think that we'd love to have you out as part of media. We'd like for you to cover some of the event, and would love for you to do maybe something on at Comic Palooza. A couple days go by, I get reached out again. Hey, you have a Back to the Future podcast. We have a podcast program. We'd love for you to do the podcast live. I said yes, let's do it. And then so then I go to do the podcast, and I'm thinking, okay, well, let me have Jeff Smith come down and do it. I have my boy Sean from Neurotropolis. He and I have been trying to work on stuff together recently, and Michael Carroll, who is so many times my saving grace, and he doesn't understand how much I appreciate that man and what he does at ESPN 975 and Gal Media. I've been working with Michael for 5 years now, and he's just a great dude, and every time I would see him, we would talk comic book movies and stuff like that. And so he asked me to do his podcast that was live at Comic Palooza. I said yes. So anyway, they do that, and then I'm seeing this meet and greet opportunity. I'm realizing, because I asked to moderate the panel, they already had somebody moderating it. Shout out to Ernie Manous. And so I'm like, look, I was talking to loved ones, and pretty much they were saying, like, look, you're never going to be in the same room, or you don't know if you're ever going to be in the same room as Christopher Lloyd and Michael J. Fox again. You might as well just get the photo, you know? So, I mean, I didn't get any preferential treatment, and I didn't expect any, didn't ask for any. I was just a fan like everybody else, and I went in there and I paid my money to get that photo with Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd, because these movies have meant so much to me. I mean, I mentioned it on the show over the years, I'm sure, and I mentioned it in the book. My grandmother succumbed to Parkinson's disease. You know, that's what ended her life, you know, were the long-term effects of it. And she didn't have it for nearly as long as Michael J. has had it, but she got it older in age, whereas he got it younger. And it's strange to me that, you know, these have always been my favorite movies, you know, and when they became my favorite movies, it was around a similar time that my grandmother was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And the ability to stand next to Michael J. and to Christopher Lloyd, even for a brief few seconds, and get a photograph was pretty incredible. You know, it was really amazing, because Christopher Lloyd, I've said it to him, and I've said it on this show, and I've said it always, has always been one of my favorite actors. I've seen nearly every movie that he's done, including some that, you know, people probably not have heard of, like Going South, which was the original Western he did with Mary Steenburgen and Jack Nicholson. And to have that photo, which is now prominently displayed on my refrigerator and obviously in my phone for life, it meant a lot, man. And honestly, I sat down, I was waiting for Jeff, who was in line to meet Chris Lloyd. I was sitting there at Comic Palooza looking at that photograph, and I got emotional. I'm getting emotional almost right now thinking about it, because of what it means to me and what these movies have meant to me. They're more than just favorite films that I've watched. They've been comfort food. They've been, man, I've had a really rough week. Let me put Back to the Future on. They've done all kinds of things for me, and I've had hours and hours and hours of conversation. I've had hours and hours of writing thousands of words. And I've had several podcasts off of this show. You know, just conversations with people. I've been on other people's shows talking about Back to the Future, more than I can even remember, you know? And to be sitting in the same building at the same time as Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, getting that photo, and then getting to go sit in front of an audience, you know, which I didn't even think anybody was going to turn up for a podcast. It was at the end of the night. It was 8 o'clock. People stuck around, and they checked out Back to the Future, the podcast, live. And I don't know, we had, maybe 40 people in there or something. It wasn't a huge room anyway. But to have those moments, I mean, it was incredible. And then to post the photo on Instagram and have Leslie Zemeckis say, "Oh, you're with my buddies." I mean, Leah Thompson even liked the photo. It's insane. And what it reminds me of is really what Back to the Future has always been about. Back to the Future, as I said in the live podcast, is about choices. That's what that movie's about. in a lot of ways. How one choice can change your entire density. And I think about that stuff all the time. I go back and like if my mother was born in Oklahoma, my father in Waco, Texas. My grandparents are in Alabama. Somehow these three entities find their way to Houston. If my mother didn't live in the house that she lived in, I wouldn't have gone to the schools that I lived in. Do you know what I mean? I went to because it was in that neighborhood. If I didn't go to those schools, I wouldn't have met my best friends where we started a band together. If I didn't start that band, I wouldn't have been into radio. If I didn't start into radio, I wouldn't have linked up with Booker. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't have done this podcast. Like there's so many things that have happened because of one choice. One choice. You know? Had I not started this podcast, I never would have gone and taken that photo. It was that choice. Had I not started this podcast, I would have never reached out to Comic Palooza thinking I had some podcast credibility to even try to get in the room. Had I not reached out to Comic Palooza, I wouldn't have hosted the 20th anniversary panel with John Heder and Efren Ramirez for Napoleon Dynamite. I did that this weekend. Insane. I'm backstage talking to John Heder and Efren Ramirez. We're talking about Christopher Lloyd. We're talking about Back to the Future. In the back, we're talking about Back to the Future. We're talking about movies that we like Chris Lloyd in. Efren Ramirez mentioned The Lone Ranger, which I had not seen. John Heder didn't even hear of that. He was on IMDb looking it up. And then I'm sitting there talking to them about Clue. And John Heder, again, didn't know that Christopher Lloyd was in Clue. I was like, he played Professor Plum. He goes, oh my God, he did. And just to have that conversation backstage was awesome. I wish I would have recorded that. Then we went out on stage and had the moment that we had with them. And they were great, by the way. I mean, I can't put them over enough and how gracious they were. And we had great conversation on stage. And I just really enjoyed it, man. Just really enjoyed this weekend. And it reinvigorated my love for Back to the Future. It did. And I'm working on doing some things for this show to bolster this show up, make it more awesome, get better guests. You can't really get better guests, get more guests. Let me say that. How do you top Leah Thompson and Bob Gale and Chris Lloyd and Crispin Glover and all the other casts I've had on? You know? It's just been an incredible honor to do this show, and this weekend made me feel like that. It made me feel happy. And by the way, had some Back to the Future the podcast fans in Comic Palooza. Some people stopped me and recognized me somehow, and we had some good conversations there. So shout out to the Comic Palooza crowd again. I felt home. I felt at home, you know. But look, guys, I'm going to put the pin in season 10 with this. I'll be back later this year. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere this year. It's only May. I guess maybe by the time you hear this, it's June. But it's June. We got 6 months of the year left. And I'm going to make sure that I come up with some bad-ass ideas for Back to the Future, the podcast, and keep this thing going. I've like I said, I thought of several times calling it a day. I even told my wife at one moment for this season 10, I said, I'm going to do season 10 seasons. That sounds like a good wrap. But I'm just not finished yet. You know? I'm just not finished yet. And I want to make this show better. I want to bring y'all better conversations, more engaged conversations, more thought. And this is where I'm going to leave y'all. I'm going to leave you all with an unanswerable question. You might say, what does that mean? Well, there are certain questions that you can think about in movies that you just can't answer. I get this from the Rewatchables podcast, which they just did Back to the Future 2. I'm going to make that a topic of conversation, trust me, in season 11. They're unanswerable questions. But I'm going to leave you this unanswerable question, which is something that comes up in a movie that is difficult to find what the answer is. It's almost like what's in the briefcase in Pulp Fiction? We don't know. We'll never know. It's an unanswerable question. This was posed to me minutes before I walked out on stage with John Heder and Efren Ramirez for the Napoleon Dynamite panel. This question was posed to me by Jeff Smith. And this is the answer. Or this is the question, rather. It doesn't have an answer. If Marty did not go back to 1955 and have that interaction with Goldie Wilson, where he told Goldie Wilson, that's right, you're going to be mayor. Mayor. Man, I kind of killed that. Mayor. Right? If he didn't have that interaction with him, that put the seed in his brain to run for mayor, then what did? What made Goldie Wilson want to run for mayor in 1985 and be mayor? How did that happen? It's an unanswerable question, but I'm leaving that to you, pinheads. Give us the answer. Tweet him to me, email him to me. Brad Gilmore at can'twaitforever.com is my email. You can also hit me up on the socials at Brad Gilmore, pretty much everywhere except for TikTok, which is at Boat Gilmore. And this has been Back to the Future, the podcast, season 10. I hope you enjoyed the live show. This is kind of an epilogue to the live show. And we will see you for season 11. And we're going to have hell of a season 11. But until then, I'm your friend in time, Brad Gilmore. This is Back to the Future, the podcast, the only podcast looking back in time at the greatest film trilogy of all time, Back to the Future. And I will see you again in the future.